In 967 BC, as King David lay on his deathbed, the kingdom of Israel stood on the precipice of great change. The old ruler, who had once united 12 disparate tribes into a single state, was fading in his Jerusalem palace. His body, worn thin by years of war and rule, could no longer be warmed even by many blankets. Court servants brought him the young maiden Abishag, so that she might warm the king with her body. But David's strength ebbed with each passing day. In these anxious days, a struggle for the throne erupted among the king's sons, each dreaming of inheriting power over the mighty empire. Adonijah, the eldest of David's surviving sons, considered himself the rightful heir. According to ancient Israeli traditions, the crown indeed belonged to him as the eldest in the lineage. He did not wait for his father's death and began to act decisively. Adonijah gathered a detachment of bodyguards, won over Joab, David's renowned commander, and high priest Abiathar. He arranged a lavish feast at the Rogel Spring, inviting all his brothers except for one, and many influential courtiers. At this feast, Adonijah effectively proclaimed himself king, hoping to present his aged father with a fait accompli. It seemed power was already in his hands, but in the Jerusalem palace, Adonijah had a dangerous rival he should not have forgotten. Solomon, King David and Bathsheba's youngest son, was not invited to the feast. His mother was the very woman for whom David had once committed a grave sin. The king saw Bathsheba, the wife of his commander Uriah the Hittite, bathing, was overcome with passion for her, and ordered her brought to the palace. To conceal Bathsheba's pregnancy, David sent her husband to certain death in battle. From this sinful union, Solomon was born. The prophet Nathan denounced the king for his crime, and David repented, promising to pass the throne to Bathsheba's son as atonement. When the news of Adonijah's actions reached the prophet Nathan, he did not hesitate. Together with Bathsheba, they appeared before the dying David and reminded him of his vow. The king, despite his weakness, retained clarity of mind. He ordered Solomon to be immediately anointed king. High priest Zadok, the prophet Nathan, and commander Benaiah carried out the king's will. Solomon was placed on the king's mule, led to the spring of Gihon, and there the anointing ceremony was performed. The sounds of trumpets and the jubilation of the people echoed throughout Jerusalem. The news reached Adonijah during his feast, scattering his guests in terror. Adonijah himself, in fear, rushed to the altar and clung to its horns, begging for mercy. Solomon promised to spare his life if he remained a loyal subject. Soon after, King David died, having reigned for 40 years. Solomon ascended the throne at the age of about 20. For the first 2 years, he ruled as co-regent with his father, and after David's death, he became the sole ruler of the United Kingdom of Israel. The young king inherited an empire whose borders stretched from the Euphrates River in the north to the Egyptian border in the south. His father left him not only vast lands but also a well-organized army, an established administration, and accumulated wealth. However, the inheritance was not only glorious but also dangerous. Adonijah soon asked Solomon for permission to marry Abishag, David's last concubine. Solomon saw this request as a new attempt to seize power and ordered his brother's execution. Thus began the sole reign of the third king of Israel. After Solomon consolidated his hold on the throne and eliminated all potential claimants to power, he went to the sanctuary in Gibeon to offer sacrifices to the Lord. There, in a night vision, God appeared to him and offered him anything he wished. The young king did not ask for long life, riches, or the death of his enemies. Instead, he asked for wisdom and discernment to judge his people justly and to distinguish between good and evil. The Lord was pleased with such a request and promised to grant Solomon not only wisdom but also what he had not asked for: riches, glory, and long life. However, there was a condition. The king must not deviate from serving the Most High. Solomon made a promise, and from that day on, wisdom became his main distinguishing feature. The fame of Solomon's intellect soon spread throughout the land. Ancient chronicles attest that his wisdom surpassed that of all the sons of the East and all the wisdom of the Egyptians. He possessed extensive knowledge in astrology and medicine, and wrote treatises on trees, beasts, birds, fish, and reptiles. He is credited with 3,000 proverbs and 1,005 songs. Solomon studied nature from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop growing on the wall. His judgments on human nature, recorded in the book of Proverbs, still amaze with their depth of understanding. People came from everywhere to hear his wise words. The most famous example of Solomon's wisdom was the case of two women who came to the king with one infant. Both claimed to be the child's mother. They lived in the same house, and each had given birth to a son around the same time. One of the women accidentally smothered her baby in her sleep, and then swapped her dead child for the other woman's living infant. In the morning, an argument ensued. Each swore that the living infant belonged to her. There were no witnesses, no evidence. Solomon listened to both and ordered a sword to be brought. He commanded the living infant to be cut in half and given to each woman. One immediately agreed to this decision, saying, "Let him not be mine or yours." The other, in despair, cried out, "My lord, give her the living child, and by no means slay him." It was at this moment that Solomon pointed to her and said, "This is the true mother." News of this judgment spread throughout Israel, and the people were filled with reverent fear for their ruler. Solomon's wisdom was evident not only in judicial decisions but also in the administration of the state. He carried out important administrative reforms that changed the very structure of Israeli society. Before his reign, the country was divided along tribal lines. The 12 tribes of Israel retained their distinctiveness and internal self-governance. Solomon divided the kingdom's territory into 12 administrative regions, whose borders did not coincide with the tribal boundaries. At the head of each region, he appointed an official directly subordinate to the king. This weakened the power of the tribal elders and strengthened central authority. The king created a far-reaching administrative apparatus of scribes, tax collectors, and overseers. Each region was required to support the royal court for 1 month each year, providing food and other necessary supplies. Solomon also reformed the army, making it more modern and combat-ready. He created 2 new branches of troops, cavalry and chariots. Before this, the Israelites fought mainly on foot, relying on the number and bravery of their warriors. Now, thousands of horses were kept in the royal stables, and Israeli chariots could compete with Egyptian and Assyrian ones. The king fortified key cities, turning them into powerful fortresses. He introduced a stable tax system, labor, and military conscription. All adult men were required to work a certain number of days a year on royal construction projects or in royal mines. Solomon began extensive exploitation of copper deposits in Edom, which brought significant revenue to the treasury. All of this required wise management. Otherwise, the people would have revolted against the unbearable burden. But Solomon knew how to find a balance between the needs of the state and the patience of his subjects. The years of Solomon's reign were a time of unprecedented prosperity for the kingdom of Israel. After decades of wars waged by his father David, the country finally found peace. Solomon was not a warrior by nature. He preferred diplomacy to military campaigns. The treaties he concluded and the dynastic marriages secured the borders and created conditions for trade development. Israel became an important trade hub through which caravan routes passed from Egypt to Mesopotamia and from Arabia to the Mediterranean coast. Merchants from all over the Middle East transported their goods through Israeli lands, generously paying for the right of passage. The royal treasury was replenished with gold, silver, and precious stones. Solomon established close trade relations with the Phoenician city of Tyre. King Hiram of Tyre became his loyal ally and business partner. The Phoenicians were renowned as the best seafarers and traders of their time. Solomon concluded a favorable agreement with Hiram. The Israelites supplied wheat and olive oil, and in return, the Phoenicians granted access to their ports and ships. Together, they organized maritime expeditions to distant lands. The Israeli fleet in the Indian Ocean sailed to the shores of Ophir, from where they brought gold, precious stones, ivory, and exotic animals. These voyages took up to 3 years, but the profits were enormous. Trade was also conducted with Egypt and Arabia, and likely with Babylon and India. Riches flowed into Jerusalem from all corners of the known world. Gold and silver ceased to be rare commodities in the capital. Chronicles state that silver was valued no more than stones during Solomon's reign. The king amassed such wealth as no ruler before him had known. His palace was adorned with gold, precious stones, and carved wood. Servants served food on golden platters, and wine was drunk from golden goblets. Even the shields of the royal bodyguards were covered with gold plates. Prosperity touched not only the royal court but also the common people. Biblical chroniclers write that every man in Judah and Israel sat peacefully under his own vine and under his own fig tree, from Dan to Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. This metaphorical expression signifies that people lived in security and abundance, engaged in peaceful labor. There were no wars that took men away from their homes and devastated the fields. There were no enemy raids that burned crops and drove off livestock. The land yielded rich harvests. Shepherds bred numerous flocks, and artisans perfected their crafts. Merchants grew wealthy from caravan trade, and residents of border towns earned their living by providing services to passing merchants. Of course, not everyone lived equally well, and the tax burden weighed heavily on many. But overall, the era of Solomon was remembered as the golden age of Israeli history. The king's fame spread far beyond his kingdom. Rulers of neighboring countries sent embassies with gifts, seeking the friendship of the powerful and wise ruler. Some sought trade relations, others military alliances, and some simply wished to hear his wise words. Solomon received everyone with royal generosity, astonishing guests with the luxury of his court and the depth of his judgments. The most famous visit was that of the Queen of Sheba, ruler of a distant southern land. She arrived with a huge caravan laden with spices, gold, and precious stones to test Solomon with riddles. The king answered all her questions, demonstrating his renowned wisdom. The queen was so astonished that her spirit soared. She confessed that what she had heard about Solomon did not convey even half the truth about his wisdom and greatness. After a long conversation, the queen presented Solomon with even greater riches and returned to her country. Solomon's greatest achievement, eclipsing all his other accomplishments, was the construction of the Temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. King David himself had dreamed of building a magnificent house for God to replace the portable tent where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. However, the prophet Nathan informed David of the Lord's will. It was not for him, who had shed much blood in wars, to build the sanctuary. This honor was destined for his son, who would be a king of peace. David resigned himself to God's decision but began to prepare for future construction. He amassed a vast quantity of gold, silver, bronze, iron, and stone. He concluded an agreement with King Hiram of Tyre for the supply of cedar wood from Lebanon. All this passed to Solomon, along with the throne. In the 4th year of his reign, Solomon began to realize his great plan. According to the biblical narrative, this was the 480th year after the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. The site chosen for the temple was Mount Moriah in Jerusalem, where, according to tradition, Abraham prepared to sacrifice his son Isaac. Solomon turned to his ally Hiram for help. The king of Tyre sent a skilled craftsman named Hiram Abith, as well as carpenters and other skilled artisans. Phoenician craftsmen were renowned for their expertise in working with wood and metal. They were to teach the Israelites the subtleties of construction art. The scale of the construction was astounding to its contemporaries. Solomon mobilized 30,000 Israelites for the work, who labored in shifts. 10,000 worked in Lebanon each month, felling timber, then rested at home for 2 months. In addition, 150,000 Canaanites and Phoenicians were employed as laborers and stonecutters. 3,300 overseers managed the work. Cedars and cypresses, the most valuable building materials of the time, were supplied by King Hiram from the Lebanese forests. Huge logs were floated down the sea to the Israeli coast, and from there transported to Jerusalem. Stones were quarried on site, on Mount Moriah, where they were dressed by the stonecutters of Solomon, Hiram, and the inhabitants of the Phoenician city of Byblos. They were delivered to the construction site already dressed, so that no hammer, chisel, or any other iron tool was heard during the construction of the temple. Copper for the temple columns and furnishings was supplied from Solomon's copper mines in Edom. War spoils from David, and trade revenues provided gold and silver for the construction. Nothing was spared for the house of the Lord. The temple building itself was constructed over 7 years, from 957 to 950 BC. According to other data, these dates relate to the period from 1014 to 1007 BC. The work was completed in the 8th month of the 11th year of Solomon's reign. The entire temple complex, including the royal palace, the palace for the daughter of the Egyptian pharaoh, whom Solomon married, and other buildings, took 16 years to build. The temple was a magnificent structure, relatively small in size, but striking in its beauty and richness of decoration. It was built in the style of ancient Near Eastern sanctuaries and consisted of 3 main parts. The vestibule welcomed visitors, followed by the sanctuary, where the altar for burning incense, the golden table for the showbread, and 10 golden lampstands were located. In the innermost part was the Holy of Holies, a small square room that only the high priest could enter once a year. There, The Ark of the Covenant was kept, a sacred chest with the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments. The walls of the sanctuary were lined with cedar boards and covered with gold. The floor was paved with cypress boards, also gilded. Carved cherubim, palm trees, and flowers adorned the walls. 2 enormous bronze columns, cast by Master Hiram, stood before the entrance. In the temple courtyard was a large bronze altar for burnt offerings and an enormous bronze laver, called the sea, standing on 12 bronze bulls. The celebration of the temple's dedication took place the year after its completion, in the 7th month, before the Feast of Tabernacles. It was the greatest solemnity in the entire history of the Israelite people. Solomon summoned the elders of all the tribes, the heads of clans and families, and the entire people of Israel to Jerusalem. The priests solemnly carried the Ark of the Covenant from the tabernacle, where it had been kept since the time of King David, to the new sanctuary. The procession moved to the singing of the Levites and the sound of trumpets. Solomon and all the people walked before and behind the ark, offering so many sheep and oxen that they could not be counted. The priests carried the ark into the Holy of Holies and placed it under the wings of 2 enormous cherubim, carved from olive wood and covered with gold. When the priests came out of the sanctuary, a cloud filled the house of the Lord. This signified that God's presence had descended into the built temple. The priests could not continue their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the temple. Then Solomon addressed the people and proclaimed that the Lord had said, "It is my will to dwell in the thick darkness, and I have built for myself a house, a dwelling place for me, to dwell in forever." At the same time, the king emphasized the paradox. But will God indeed dwell on earth? Behold, the heavens and the highest heavens cannot contain you, much less this house that I have built. These words showed Solomon's deep understanding of the divine nature. After this, the king offered a public prayer, kneeling before the whole assembly of Israel and raising his hands to heaven. He blessed the Lord for fulfilling the promise made to his father David. Solomon asked God to preserve his mercy for the house of David and to hear the prayers that would be offered in this temple. He prayed that the Lord would heed the pleas of people who turned to him from this place. When a sinner would swear an oath before the altar, when the people suffered defeat from their enemies due to their sins, when drought or famine occurred, when a foreigner came from a distant land for the sake of the Lord's name, Solomon prayed for forgiveness, for help, for mercy for his people. This prayer, full of wisdom and deep religious feeling, became one of the most famous in the history of Israel. The celebration of the temple's dedication lasted for 14 days. Solomon offered 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep in sacrifice. The entire nation feasted and rejoiced. A multitude of people gathered from the entrance of Hamath to the river of Egypt to participate in the celebration. The king generously distributed gifts, and the priests performed the prescribed rites. Never before had Israel witnessed such splendor. Never before had the people been so united in glorifying their God and their king. When the festival concluded, the people dispersed to their homes, blessing Solomon and rejoicing in all the good that the Lord had done for David and for his people Israel. The temple became not just a religious center but also a symbol of national unity and royal power. It was part of the royal palace complex and undoubtedly dominated the surrounding structures. The palace was located next to the temple and was connected to it by a separate entrance. Near the temple, Solomon built his summer palace and the palace for the daughter of the Egyptian pharaoh. This entire group of buildings formed a magnificent architectural ensemble, testifying to the glory of the Kingdom of Israel. Pilgrims who came to Jerusalem for festivals were amazed by the beauty of the temple and the wealth of the royal palaces. The fame of Solomon's sanctuary spread throughout the Near East. Rulers of neighboring countries sent gifts for the temple, seeking the favor of the mighty God of Israel. The temple stood for almost 400 years until the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, and throughout this time, it remained the main sanctuary of Judaism. Solomon's construction activities were not limited to Jerusalem. He fortified and rebuilt many cities throughout his kingdom, turning them into powerful fortresses and trade centers. The king paid special attention to strategically important points that controlled trade routes and state borders. Archaeological excavations confirm the scale of Solomon's construction. In several cities, remains of monumental structures dating back to the 10th century BC, that is to say, the reign of Solomon, have been discovered. The quality of the buildings indicates that only a ruler with significant resources and a large labor force could organize such construction. One of the most important cities rebuilt by Solomon was Gezer. The Pharaoh of Egypt captured this Canaanite city, destroyed it, and gave it to Solomon as a dowry for his daughter. Excavations showed that the city was indeed destroyed between 1200 and 1000 BC. On the ruins, a new city was built with strong fortifications, famous gates, and a palace. The restoration took place in the second half of the 10th century, during Solomon's era. Gezer's gates had a characteristic design with 3 pairs of chambers on either side of the passage. Exactly the same gates were found in other cities mentioned in the Bible as built by Solomon, Megiddo and Hazor. The identical architecture indicates that all these cities were built according to a single plan by royal architects. Solomon also built cities to house his chariots and cavalry. Solomon's stables became legendary. According to some sources, the king had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen. Maintaining them required huge stables, fodder supplies, and storage for chariots and weapons. Such military cities were built in different parts of the kingdom to ensure rapid troop mobilization in case of danger. In addition to military cities, Solomon built cities for warehouses where supplies of grain, olive oil, and other provisions were stored in case of crop failure or war. The entire country was covered by a network of well-fortified and well-organized cities. All these construction works required a huge amount of labor. Solomon introduced compulsory labor, which applied to the entire population of the kingdom. The Israelites worked in shifts, as mentioned earlier during the description of the temple construction. Descendants of the Canaanite peoples who remained in the country after its conquest were turned into more permanent laborers. They performed the heaviest tasks, quarried stone, carried loads, and burned lime. Israelites held positions as overseers, managers, and soldiers, but they were not exempt from royal duties. Chronicles mention grumbling among the people due to the heavy taxes and levies. Residents of the northern regions were particularly dissatisfied, believing they bore a disproportionate share of the burden. Despite the discontent, Solomon's construction program continued throughout his reign. The king not only fortified cities but also took care of their improvement. In the capital and other major centers, he built public buildings, palaces for officials, and houses for storing royal treasures. Crafts developed, including pottery, weaving, and metalworking. Royal workshops produced goods of the highest quality, which were exported to other countries. Israel transformed from a land of shepherds and farmers into a developed state with urban culture, trade, and diverse crafts. This was a time of rapid change, when the old patriarchal way of life gave way to a new, more complex social order. Not everyone was ready for such changes, and tension in society gradually grew. One of the features of Solomon's reign was his enormous harem, which included 700 wives and 300 concubines. Such a large number of women in the royal household was not an exceptional phenomenon for ancient Eastern monarchies, but even against the backdrop of other rulers, Solomon's harem stood out in its size. Many of these marriages were political in nature. Forming dynastic alliances by marrying royal daughters was a common practice at that time. Each new wife from a foreign royal house meant strengthening relations with her country, guaranteeing peace, and developing trade ties. The most important such marriage was the alliance with Egypt. Solomon married the daughter of the Egyptian pharaoh, which was an exceptional honor. Egypt at that time was a great power, and pharaohs rarely gave their daughters to foreign rulers. This marriage testified to Solomon's high status and that of his kingdom in the eyes of the international community. Among Solomon's wives were Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. These were representatives of those peoples whom the Lord had warned the sons of Israel. You shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they enter into marriage with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. But Solomon became deeply attached to these women. For each of his foreign wives, he allowed religious rites to be performed according to their people's customs. Altars and shrines to foreign gods multiplied in and around the palace. Historians believe Solomon did this not so much out of religious indifference as out of political calculation. By allowing his wives to worship their gods, he demonstrated respect for their peoples and strengthened diplomatic ties. However, over time, the presence of so many foreign women in the court began to influence the king himself. The biblical narrative testifies that in Solomon's old age, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. Solomon began to serve Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. He built a shrine for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the mountain east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites. Thus he did for all his foreign wives, who sacrificed and burned incense to their gods. This was a direct violation of the first commandment, and the condition on which God had granted him wisdom and promised to bless his reign. The Lord was angry with Solomon because he had turned away from the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and commanded him not to follow other gods. But Solomon did not keep the commandment of the Lord. According to the biblical narrative, God declared to the king that for this reason, he would tear the kingdom away from him and give it to his servant. However, this would not happen during Solomon's lifetime, for the sake of David, his father, but would be fulfilled in the days of his son. And even then, not the entire kingdom would be taken away. One tribe would remain for the house of David, for the sake of David, the servant of God, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which the Lord had chosen. This prophecy determined the fate of the kingdom of Israel for many decades to come. In addition to religious consequences, the enormous harem required colossal expenses for maintenance. 1,000 women needed luxurious chambers, servants, clothing, and jewelry. Separate palaces were built for them, and gardens were laid out. All this placed an additional burden on the royal treasury, and ultimately, on the taxpayers. The people saw that a significant portion of their labor went to support the royal wives and concubines, many of whom were foreigners. This caused discontent, especially among the religiously minded Israelites, who considered such close association with pagan women unacceptable. Rumors that the king himself had begun participating in pagan rituals undermined his authority as a defender of the faith of his fathers. Thus, Solomon's harem, conceived as a tool of diplomacy, gradually turned into a source of internal problems for the kingdom. Beneath the outward brilliance and prosperity of Solomon's kingdom lay growing contradictions that were destined to tear the country apart after his death. The roots of this discord went deep into the history of the Israelite people. The 12 tribes, descended from the 12 sons of the patriarch Jacob, had never been fully united. The southern tribes, especially Judah, and the northern tribes, among which the tribe of Ephraim stood out, had long been rivals. King David managed to unite them under his rule through his charisma, military successes, and wise governance. But even during his reign, there were rebellions by the northern tribes. Solomon inherited a united kingdom but could not, or would not, maintain the delicate balance between its parts. Solomon's administrative reform, which divided the country into 12 regions based on territorial rather than tribal lines, undermined the power of the tribal elders of the northern tribes. They lost a significant portion of their influence, which now passed to officials appointed by the king. Many of these officials were from the southern tribes or were foreigners. Northerners perceived this as discrimination and the dominance of Judah over the other tribes. Heavy taxes and labor conscription exacerbated discontent. The northern regions were wealthier and more fertile than the southern ones, so they bore the brunt of the tax burden. Workers from the northern tribes toiled month after month on royal construction projects in Jerusalem, building the temple, palaces, and fortifications of the capital, located in the heart of the territory of the tribe of Judah. All this led to growing separatist sentiments. The elders of the northern tribes held secret meetings, discussing the possibility of secession from the house of David. A man named Jeroboam, son of Nebat, of the tribe of Ephraim, gradually emerged as the leader of the discontented. He was a capable and energetic young man, whom Solomon noticed and appointed chief over all the workers of the house of Joseph, that is, the northern tribes. Jeroboam used this position to strengthen his authority among his kinsmen. One day, as he was leaving Jerusalem, he was met by the prophet Ahijah of Shiloh. The prophet tore his new garment into 12 pieces and told Jeroboam to take 10. He explained that the Lord intended to tear the kingdom away from the house of Solomon and give it to Jeroboam. This prophecy emboldened Jeroboam. He began openly preparing for rebellion against Solomon, but the king learned of this and attempted to arrest the rebel. Jeroboam had to flee to Egypt, where Pharaoh Shishak gave him refuge. He remained there until Solomon's death, maintaining contact with the discontented in Israel and awaiting his time. The very fact that the Egyptian pharaoh harbored the enemy of the Israeli king showed how much Solomon's position had weakened by the end of his reign. The friendship with Egypt, sealed by a dynastic marriage at the beginning of his reign, no longer guaranteed security. The pharaoh understood that internal discord in Israel was beneficial to Egypt and therefore supported a potential rebel. The last years of Solomon's reign were overshadowed not only by internal problems but also by external threats. In Edom, Hadad, a representative of the royal house of Edom, exterminated by David's troops, raised a rebellion. In Syria, Rezon appeared, who gathered a band of robbers, captured Damascus, and founded an independent kingdom there. Solomon was losing control over the territories conquered by his father. Treasury revenues were declining, while expenses for suppressing rebellions and maintaining the luxurious court only grew. The golden age was coming to an end. The wise king, who in his youth asked God for understanding rather than riches, found himself surrounded by gold in his old age, but deprived of God's favor. His heart, corrupted by many wives and luxury, had turned away from the Lord. The prophecy of the kingdom's collapse hung over the land like a thundercloud. Solomon reigned for 40 years, from 970 to 930 BC, according to the most common chronology. According to other data, the dates of his reign are 967 and 928 BC. He died in advanced age, leaving the kingdom to his son Rehoboam. The biblical chronicles do not provide details about the king's final days and death. There is no mention of illness or any deathbed dispositions. Solomon simply rested and was buried in the city of David, that is, in Jerusalem. His reign ended as it began, without wars or dramatic events. But this peace was deceptive. The contradictions that had accumulated over 40 years of reign were ready to erupt. Rehoboam, Solomon's son by Naamah, the Ammonite, took the Jerusalem throne without hindrance. In Judah, the royal house of David enjoyed immense authority, and no one disputed the king's son's right to the throne. However, the young king needed to obtain the consent of the northern tribes for his reign. To this end, he traveled to Shechem, an ancient city in the heart of the northern tribes' territory, where their representatives had gathered. At the head of the elders of the 10 northern tribes stood Jeroboam, who had returned from Egypt. He was summoned by his kinsmen as a man capable of defending their interests before the new king. The representatives of the northern tribes approached Rehoboam with a request that expressed all the discontent accumulated during Solomon's reign. They said, "Your father made our yoke harsh, but you lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke that he put on us, and we will serve you." Rehoboam asked for 3 days to consider. He consulted with the elders who had served his father Solomon. They advised him to yield to the people. "If today you will be a servant to this people, and please them by giving them a favorable answer, then they will be your servants forever." This was wise advice, based on an understanding of the real situation, but Rehoboam did not heed the elders. Instead, he turned to the young men who had grown up with him and served in his court. These young courtiers gave completely opposite advice. "Show the people your strength. Do not yield to their demands." They proposed an answer. "My little finger is thicker than my father's loins. My father laid upon you a heavy yoke, but I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions." On the 3rd day, Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam for an answer. The young king, rejecting the elders' advice and heeding the youth, uttered those very arrogant words. The reaction was instantaneous. The representatives of the northern tribes, in anger, replied, "What portion have we in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Now look to your own house, David." These words signified a complete break with the house of David. All Israel departed to their tents. Rehoboam attempted to restore control by sending Adoniram, the overseer of the forced labor, to the rebels. But the Israelites stoned him, and he died. Rehoboam barely managed to flee back to Jerusalem with his troops. Thus ended the united kingdom established by David. From this moment, the history of Israel took 2 paths. Judah, with its throne in Jerusalem, remained under the rule of the house of David, while the northern 10 tribes united into a separate kingdom of Israel under Jeroboam. The division of the kingdom marked the beginning of decline. The northerners, having established their own dynasty, quickly confirmed the new ruler, Jeroboam. The capital of the kingdom of Israel became the city of Samaria, built later, but initially Shechem. Wishing to completely distance his subjects from Jerusalem, Jeroboam established new places of worship, made golden calves, and set them up in Bethel and Dan, so that the people would not go to the Jerusalem temple for festivals. This decision had a profound impact on the fate of both countries. Religious unity was lost. Rival cults appeared in its place. In Judah, the house of David retained power over a smaller part of the former empire. Only two tribes, Judah and Benjamin. The economic situation of the southern kingdom was weaker, the land was less fertile, and the population was smaller. However, Judah's main advantage remained the Jerusalem temple, the only legitimate sanctuary in the eyes of thousands of Israelites who did not wish to worship the new religion of Jeroboam. This allowed the house of David to retain respect and spiritual influence over the entire country. Gradually, internal strife, power struggles, conflicts with neighbors, the tax burden, and increasing religious disagreements undermined both new powers. The northern kingdom of Israel often suffered from palace coups, dynastic changes, wars with Judah, and foreign invaders. Less than 2 centuries later, the Assyrian king Sargon II invaded the country and, in 722 BC, completely destroyed the kingdom of Israel, deporting a large part of the population into captivity. Thus, the 10 northern tribes disappeared, their fate still a mystery to historians. Judah endured significantly longer, although it also faced internal crises and external dangers. It became a vassal first of Egypt, then of Assyria, and later of Babylon. In 586 BC, the city of Jerusalem was destroyed by the troops of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II. Solomon's temple was burned, and the inhabitants were taken into the famous Babylonian captivity. It was only after several decades that the descendants of David were able to return to their homeland and build the Second Temple. Solomon left behind not only the temple, cities, and administrative system and laws, but also a grand spiritual legacy. His wisdom entered the Book of Proverbs, the Song of Songs, and the Book of Ecclesiastes, which became part of Jewish and Christian traditions and beliefs. The figure of Solomon was considered for centuries a symbol of a just judge and a wise ruler. His name is associated with the ideal of a righteous world where law and mercy triumph. But the fate of the kingdom he built through effort and compromise showed that without a balance between secular power, morality, and faith, no empire can endure forever. The divided kingdom became a lesson for all future generations. Solomon's triumph is not eternal but temporal, although the memory of him lives on to this day. His ascent is a brilliant page in history. His fall, a warning. Riches, power, and even wisdom can prove powerless against internal contradictions and the loss of spiritual guidance. But where centuries pass, walls crumble, nations disappear, a light of hope remains, an example of one who sought wisdom before riches, who united peoples, although he could not keep them united. And perhaps, in every generation, the question will be asked, what is more valuable, power, gold, or wisdom capable of changing the course of history? Based on this story, translate the story into English, without altering the core content, in standard, complete, and grammatically correct English, without omitting content, with a translation length equivalent to the original, with all details included, without summarizing,